just a brief introduction. I'm the user group leader for Salesforce Architects in Jacksonville, and I have started doing my meetings mostly virtually. We do a couple of like in-person meetings. We usually do them jointly with other user groups in the area. But what I usually do is I invite like wonderful presenters like Adam today to give us the latest and greatest about the functionalities and about the learning areas that we typically would like to dive into. And I do virtual meetings at around noon Eastern time that last about an hour. We like to keep them short and sweet. That seems to be the time zone that most people can actually attend. You can attend from Europe, North America, if you're interested in the topic that we cover. So just briefly, your user group leaders, me and my wife, Amy is absent today. I'm a Salesforce MVP architect and creator of Flow Canvas Academy and also SalesforceBreak.com. I just recently shared, actually, I share on Salesforce Break a lot of content. I shared recently a post actually where I was trying to marry Apex powers with Flow Canvas. The people who know me by my flow content. They always think I recommend flows for everything, which is not the truth. I try to stay well architected, and there are some situations where the powers of flow is not really sufficient. So we try to marry them with Apex invocables, Apex defined variables, and this is actually a good introduction for Adam's content today. I'm going to give you a brief introduction of who Adam is, and I'm sure he's going to give you a better introduction. He's a Salesforce MVP Hall of Fame, right? At this point, Adam.
Yep.
He has been in the ecosystem for a very long time, and he'll tell you all about his technical credentials. He's actually a technical architect at Google right now. He has an Apex course on Pluralsight, I think, and he is one of the nicest and most helpful MVPs we have around. He is always positive, so great to be around. So thank you very much for doing this for us, Adam. And the stage is yours.
Great. Appreciate it, Andy, as always. Thank you. All right. Sharing is not turned on. I'm going to request share permissions.
There you have it.
Okay. I want to share this screen. Okay. Okay, perfect. And chat over here. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well on my other screen. All right, so thank you everyone for joining from around the world, it sounds like. I saw we had Boston, Denver, Mexico, Brazil, Bay Area. So thank you all for joining. I'm here today to talk about demystifying code for admins, what I am billing as kind of taking the last step to Apex. I did give this version of the presentation a few weeks ago at True North Dreaming in Vancouver, so you might see some of that branding. Highly recommend True North Dreaming. I think they're doing it in Ontario next year, so definitely I recommend looking into that. Okay, so first of all, a little bit more about me. Andy mentioned most of these things. I'm a Salesforce technical architect, not yet certified technical architect, but technical architect nonetheless at Google, working for Google Play. 18 Salesforce certifications, a bunch of Trailhead badges. As Andy mentioned, I'm a Salesforce MVP Hall of Fame member. I'm also really passionate about teaching people to code and use code on Salesforce. I'm an 11-time Rad Women coach. Highly recommend Rad Women if you're a woman in the ecosystem looking to learn how to code. I've been fortunate enough to be able to give presentations in person in 6 different countries across 4 different continents, and virtually in a few other countries and several other continents, or at least one other continent, I guess, as well. Feel free to connect with me. Let me know you were here today on LinkedIn. And as Andy mentioned, I do have some courses specifically focused on the PD1 certification on Pluralsight. And I have I think I have a bunch of free trial codes that expire at the end of June if you're interested. So ping me, send me a message after. Happy to share one of those for free access to the end of June if you are studying for PD1. All right, so I wanted to start off with some expectations here for today. So I do want you thinking about the concepts you already know how to use in declarative development, right? I'm kind of assuming most of you have worked with a lot of, if not all of the admin declarative tools before. I'm going to briefly review those and want you to think about what are the concepts you already know how to do with those tools. I'm also going to show you some small blocks of code, and I want you focused on what are those blocks of code doing. I don't want you worrying so much about every little parentheses or bracket or ampersand or semicolon. Focus more about what the blocks of code are doing. You can always look up what the exact syntax is later. I also, this is about a 40-minute presentation. I don't necessarily want anybody thinking they're going to walk out of here knowing how to code, but I do want you believing that you can begin the process of understanding code in these 40 minutes. I'm a big believer that if you can understand code and you can do a Google search, maybe even an AI tool search, you can begin the process of writing code. But even if you don't get to the process of writing code, I think even just understanding code is going to improve your value to your company. And it's also going to increase your job and career opportunities, right? If you're able to take on some of the tasks that the developers had to do, or you had to call a developer to look into beforehand, that's going to help your company. And again, if you can say on your resume, hey, yes, I'm an admin or I'm an architect, but I understand code, maybe I can even write a little bit code, that's going to set you apart from an admin or an architect that does not have some of those skills. So ultimately, more job opportunities, more career opportunities, hopefully will lead you to a nice sum like this one here from Breaking Bad. All right, so agenda for today, just a high-level overview. I keep using this word code. We keep talking about Apex. What is code in Apex really? And then I'm then going to do a brief review of admin tools and concepts you already know how to use. We're going to go into some of the Apex building blocks, how we put Apex together. We're going to see all these building blocks put together with some Apex examples, and then we're going to wrap things up and talk about the next steps as well. All right, so my hypothesis for today is that you're already all developers, you just may not know it yet, and we'll see if you agree with me here at the end. Okay, so to start off, what is code? I think it's not as scary as you may think. Whoops. Okay, so when we talk about what is code, it's computer language at the end of the day. It's all it is. It's ones and zeros, right? It's language that your computer, or in our case, Salesforce, is going to be able to understand. Now, I don't know about you. I don't really speak very well in ones and zeros. I'm a human. I like speaking human languages. And because of this, most humans also not great at speaking in ones and zeros. And so we need to take whatever we're writing that we can understand as humans, our code, our configuration, and put it through what's called a compiler, or essentially a translator to convert it into ones and zeros that a computer or Salesforce can understand. And over time, we've gotten much better at this, making it more readable for humans, right? There was a time when we had to use punch cards and punch ones into a card and leave non-punched holes as zeros so the computer could read if it's a one or a zero. Kind of difficult to do, and so we started developing programming languages where we would tell the computer, hey, I have a value of 1, store it here in your memory. I have another value of 3, store it there in your memory. Combine them together, and I want another memory area in the computer to store the value of 4. That got kind of cumbersome as well, so we started building languages with logic commands like C. We focused a little bit more on the logic and less on the memory with languages like Java and Apex that were a little more human readable. And then ultimately, Salesforce just said, you know what, we don't even need these languages anymore. We can do everything declaratively. We can build the Salesforce configuration, and you don't even need to write code anymore. And while that's great, and we've maybe as admins been focused more on this part of this path. I don't know if any of you have played the game of telephone. I know we have people from different countries here. You may have tried to translate something into different languages or back into your own language. Inevitably, the farther away you get from the source, the higher the chance something is going to get lost in translation. And the same thing is the case with code. The farther away we get from the computer, the farther away we get from the ones and zeros, the more limited we are and the less we're able to exactly translate what the computer needs to do. So I'm going to take us one step closer to the ones and zeros today, away from the declarative and more focused on some of the code we can do a little bit more with and talk a little bit closer to the computer's natural language. Hopefully they'll be able to understand it a little bit better. Okay, so now I'm going to do kind of a brief review of some of the tools you've probably already used declaratively, maybe as admins, maybe as architects, and really a lot of what makes admins superheroes. And when I talk about admin tools, It's going to be things like objects and fields. It's going to be things like reports, like formulas, and of course, like flows, right? You may have even seen, if you've been around the ecosystem for a little while, some workflow rules and process builder. Similar concepts there. We can do it all now with Flow. Again, Andy has a great course on that if you're not too familiar with flows. So I will mention workflow rules and process builders a little bit, but mostly when we're talking about declarative tools, we're going to focus on flows there. And again, I want you to focus on the concepts from these tools you already know how to use. And so if we think about what is an object, what is a field, what are we doing when we're creating these? We're really constructing a data model. And we're telling Salesforce, hey, I want to build this part of my data model. I want to give it this name, and I want to give it this data type, right? When we choose a field, we have to specify, is it a number field? Is it a checkbox field? Is it a text field? We have to tell it what type of data we're working with, and we have to give it a name. And after we give it a name or a label, Salesforce is going to prompt us to also put in the API name. Usually gets auto-generated for us, right? And usually what we're doing is we're replacing spaces with underscores, and then we're adding underscore underscore seed at the end to indicate that it's custom. What we're really doing here is we're telling the computer, Salesforce, how to read this field. Code and spaces do not play very well together. You might see, if you pay close attention to the URLs, you might see a %20 show up in your URL. That is the Unicode character for the space character. So when URLs can't read spaces, they just put %20 in, and they know that means space. %20 is very ugly to have all over our code base, so instead we use underscores instead of spaces in our API names. But the API names are really what Salesforce is using to identify these fields and objects. So we can change the label to make it show up differently in the UI as much as we want. When we're writing in code, we always care about the API names here. Okay, I want to talk for a second about reports. Hopefully, many of you have built reports before. And if you think about Salesforce reports, what are they? They're really a query or a search for records based on some condition, right? We tell Salesforce, I want to run a report on this object. I want to see these fields, and I want to give some sort of filter criteria. Only show me the accounts. I want to see the account name, type, and rating. And I only want to see the accounts that are owned by everybody for all time, and where the type is customer direct and customer channel, right? That's what we're doing when we're building a report, right? We're querying for records based on some criteria. Hopefully, many of you have built formula fields before. And if you think about what is a formula field, it's this notion that we have some input, some value that we know. We're going to do some black box formula calculation on it, and we're going to output another value whose data type we specified beforehand. So when we're creating a formula field, Salesforce will say, well, is it a text formula? Is it a checkbox formula? Is it a number formula? What type of data are you calculating based on what you know and then what you're doing to it? And so we can have basic formulas, right? I might want a date formula that says take today's date, the value we know, and just add 5 to it, right? We're calculating values based on other values. We might have formulas that are a little more complex, right? Maybe I want a checkbox formula. I'm doing some sort of job application app, and I have to capture the user experience, and I have to capture what type of job it is. And so we might have, right, those values that we know, what department is this job for, and how many years of experience does this applicant have, and we have to calculate whether or not we need extra approval for it. I'm going to update this formula a little bit to make it more code friendly. Instead of the and function we're going to have the double ampersand. It means the same thing. To me, it's a little more readable, and this is how we use it in code. But the formula says the same thing. If the user experience is greater than 5 and the department on the parent job is IT, then yes, approval is required. That value we've calculated is going to be true, right? So this notion that we have some values we know, maybe they're fields, maybe they're functions, we're going to do some calculation on it and output another value whose type we specified beforehand. And we can get really complex with this, right? We can kind of chain these functions together, pass output to the other functions. For example, I presented this back April 24th. And so I might have a date time submitted value that I know, and I want to calculate a text value based on the hour that the application was submitted. And so I'm going to start here with my date time submitted, April 24th, 2015, 1:15 p.m. Behind the scenes, it gets converted to a 24-hour time, so 13:15. And we're going to take that and put it in the time value function. And when we use the time value function, we're going to take our date time submitted, and we're just going to get the 13:15 out of it. We're then going to pass that 13:15 up to the hour function, get the number 13. We're then going to pass that up to the text function and get the text 13. So we take this value we know, April 24th, 2015, 1:15 p.m., and we're going to end up outputting the text value 13 because we took the value we knew, we calculated it, did some operations on it, and we ended up with a text value at the end, right? Potentially something we're familiar with. We can also chain logic together, right? We can chain conditional statements together. So I might want to calculate the priority of an opportunity based on the amount of that opportunity, right? And I also want to point out here, we're using the underscore C and the underscores, we're using the API name here in all of our fields. And because the amount is a standard field, we don't need the underscore C on it. But we're going to say, hey, we have the amount we know, we want to calculate the priority that we don't. So we check to see, hey, is the amount greater than $1 million? If so, set the priority to high. If not, we'll check our next condition. Is the amount greater than $100,000? If not, if it is, set the priority to medium. And if none of those are true, otherwise, just set the priority to low. If you've worked with case assignment rules before, it works the same way, right? We have a list of conditionals we check in order, and then we have a fallback if none of the conditions were true, right? We're potentially familiar with this as well. All right. I mentioned we were going to talk about flows, but workflow rules and process builder works the same way, right? The concept of a flow is we take some automation, we choose an object that we want it to fire on, and we choose when it's going to fire in the case of a record triggered flow. So when we choose record triggered flow, the first thing we do is say, what object are you firing on, right? Are you going to be an account flow? Are you going to be a contact flow, a custom object flow? And then we say, are you going to fire when records are created, when they're updated, when they're created or updated, or when they're deleted? And then the other thing we have to specify is, how do we want to optimize this flow? Do we want to optimize it to run before the record is saved, right? If we're updating some fields on the record, that potentially makes sense. Or do we want to optimize it for after the record is saved? Maybe we're doing some related actions. Maybe we're updating related records. Maybe we need to require that our record has an ID first. And that doesn't happen until after the record is saved to the database. So we're familiar with this concept of choosing an object, when it'll fire, and specifying, do we want it to be optimized for before or after the record is actually saved to the database, right? And again, workflow rules process builder, the same thing. You have to choose an object, and you have to choose when it's going to fire. With flows, we can also do some other cool stuff, though. We can store values for later. We can create variables, right, resources. And we can say, hey, I want a variable. I want it to be of type text or of type number or of type pick list. Again, we're specifying what type of data are we storing. We're giving it an API name, just like we did with our fields. And we can also specify, do we want this to be a collection? Do we want it to store multiple values at once, right? Maybe we need to store a bunch of text values, and we can do that in a collection. We can also set additional criteria, right? We can have decision nodes that are going to specify what should happen when we reach this point. Should we go option A or option B, right? Do we want this logic to be and logic, or logic, custom logic? Maybe we want something to happen if conditions 1 or 2 and 3 are all true, right? We can specify what the logic is that we want to fire, just like we did with our formula field. And we can have different decision paths that take those conditions into account. If we do have collection variables, we can also loop through them, right? I might have a collection of text values called names loops, a list of names, right? And I can loop through them one at a time and take action on them. Maybe I want to do some check on them. Maybe I want to do some additional calculation and edit them, but I can loop through these collections one at a time, something we're potentially already familiar with flows. And then we can also specify with these values in our flows, should these be available for input? Should these be available for output, right? Do we want to send values to our flow? Do we want to take values in our flow and maybe send them elsewhere? Maybe we want to send them to a Lightning record page. Maybe we want to send them to some code. Maybe we want to send them elsewhere. This idea of saying, hey, we're going to take in some values, we're going to return some values elsewhere. We're familiar with this idea from flows as well. And then with flows, we can do a bunch of additional things. We can break complex processes down into subflows. We can manipulate records, right? We can create records. We can update records. We can get query records by getting them. We can delete records. Manipulating records in the Salesforce database, we can also do with flow. And ultimately, we can build these complex processes that I'm sure all of you have seen, screenshots or maybe even built super complex flows with a lot of nodes to them. And looking at it, oh my God, it's so overwhelming. But how do you understand it? You break it down one at a time. I start with this flow here. I see, okay, I have a decision. Does a case exist or does it not? If it does not, then we end. If it does, then I can create a case comment record. I can set, a variable assignment to assign a success message, right? It looks very overwhelming at first, but if we break it down piece by piece, maybe we're calling a subflow, it's going to be much easier to understand, and we know how to understand all the parts individually. So that means we can probably understand it from start to finish as well, even if it'll take a minute. Okay, so that's great. We talked about all the things we already know how to do. Let's talk a little bit about Apex, right? Which I think is just one step away from point and click. So we talked about all these concepts just now with point and click, right? We talked about conditional logic, creating variables, etc. Why did I go through this process of talking about things you potentially already know how to do? Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, it's because all of these concepts that you most likely already know how to do are the exact same concepts that you're going to be using in Apex. Okay, we talked about conditional logic. We saw it in formulas where we have multiple if statements. We saw it in flows where we have decisions. Again, also true, process builder and workflow rules. And we have it in Apex as well. We call them if statements. But we talked about this idea of creating variables. And we also talked about specifying what type of data, telling Salesforce what type of data we're going to be storing, right? We saw it in fields, we saw it in flow, and we see it in Apex. And in Apex, again, we just call them variables, just like we do in flow. We talked about this idea of chaining logic together, right? We have these complex formulas, we have these complex flows. We could potentially in the past have had complex process builders. And in Apex, we have complex processes too. We call them methods and classes, right? We have methods and we put these methods into classes and we can chain them together and have them talk to each other. We talked about this idea of querying for records, right? We saw how we can do it in a report. We also have this get records node in flow to get records. And in Apex, we have a process to get records as well. We call it SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language. We talked about this concept of we want to choose an object and some automation to fire on it and when that automation is going to fire. Right? We saw an example with Flow. We also do it with Process Builder and Workflow. And we also do it with Apex. And those are going to be your Apex triggers. We talked about looping over collections, right? We saw it with Flow. We can also do it with Process Builder. And in Apex, we call them for loops. For each record in my collection, I want to do something with it. And lastly, we talked about manipulating Salesforce records or S-object records, Salesforce object records. We can do it in Flow, we can do it in Process Builder, we can do it in Workflow. And in Apex, we do it using something called DML, Database Manipulation Language. And so if there's one takeaway I want you to have today, it's that a lot of the concepts you already know how to do from all the declarative tools are the exact same concepts that you can then reuse in Apex, right? And now I'm going to go ahead and see if I can prove it to you. Okay. We talked about this before, conditional logic, right, with if statements, if functions that we have, right? If the amount is greater than 1 million, set the priority to high, and then if not, check the next conditional, and if not, we have a fallback. And we can do the same thing in Apex, and it looks something like this. A few things I want to point out here. The first thing we have in line 1 is an if statement, right? If opportunity is greater than 1 million. So the first thing we have this word opportunity in our code. When we're dealing with formula fields, we know what record we're acting on. It's the record that the formula field is on, right? I'm setting priority on the same record that I'm checking the amount for. But in code, we have to tell it what record we're working with. So I'm going to work with some record called opportunity. I want to check the amount on that opportunity, and then I want to set the priority on the same opportunity, just like we did in our formula. But this says the same thing. If the amount on some opportunity is greater than 1 million, set the priority on that same opportunity to high. And if that's not true, we have another Apex keyword here, else. We can do an else if statement, which means, okay, the first condition wasn't true. Let's check the next condition. Else, if the amount is greater than 100,000, set the priority to medium. And then in line 7, we have a fallback else that says, well, if none of those conditions were true, then we have a fallback, just set the priority to low. Same thing that our formula field is doing. We also talked about creating variables, right? And again, when we're creating a variable, we have to give it a name, and we have to tell Salesforce what type of data it is. And then we can assign a value to it. And again, we do the same thing in Apex. So a couple variable declarations here I want to talk through. The first thing is in line 1. All variables are going to be the same. We're going to start off by telling Salesforce what type of data it is. We're going to give the variable a name, and then we're going to use the equal sign to assign that variable a value. So line 1 here, we have a variable of type integer, which is just the term in code we use for number. So we have a number called myInt. I can name it whatever I want. Usually I want to give it a name that tells me some idea of what it is or what it's going to be used for, what it represents. But for now, I'm just calling it myInteger, myInt, and I'm assigning it a value of 10. Line 2, we see another keyword, the data type string, which is essentially text, right? A string of characters together. And so we have a text value or a string called myString, and it's equal to the value Harry Potter is awesome, right? And we also see, to tell our code we're using a string, we put it in single quotes. So we have single quotes to start, single quotes to end, and we have all the characters Harry Potter is awesome. That entire value is being stored as our string variable. In addition to having what are called primitive variable types, integer, string, we can also have Salesforce record variable types, like accounts. Line 3, we see we have an account variable called myAccount, my-ACCT. And we're setting it equal to a new empty account whose fields we can populate later. Just like we did with Flow, we also have this concept of collections in Apex. One such collection is a list. I can store multiple values in a single variable. And so in line 4, we see we have a list of integers, a list of numbers called myIntList. And I'm going to assign it to a new list of integers that I populate with the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is all going to be stored in my single myIntList variable, all stored in one variable, multiple values. And then just like we can have a list of integers, we can also have a list of strings. In line 5, I'm going to assign a new variable called houses to store a bunch of Harry Potter houses. And I see Gryffindor, I see Ravenclaw. Again, in single quotes, we have multiple values in a single variable. Okay, so we talked about variables. What if we want to calculate values based on other values, like we do with formulas, right? We take some value we know, we do a black box calculation on it, and we output a value that we've calculated. And in Apex, again, we're going to do the same thing, and we call them methods. And the way methods work are we take some input parameters that we know, we do some black box calculation on it in our method, and we output a return value that we have calculated. So let's take a look at a formula we saw before, right? We have today's date that we know, we add 5 to it, and we end up with another date that we've calculated 5 days from now. I'm going to go do something similar here. And I will note sometimes code has a tendency to jump around. And so we're actually going to ignore lines 1 to 3 for now, and we're going to start with line 5. And line 5 says, I have an integer called myInt equal to the value of 12. Great. Okay. Now line 6 is a little bit different. I want another integer variable called myNewInt, but instead of assigning it a value, I'm going to go calculate a value in a method called add5. And add5 is going to call a method or a formula black box calculation that we have defined in line 1. Okay, before we look at what add5 is doing, we also see in line 6 that we're giving add5 that myInt variable we just assigned in line 5. So myNewInt is equal to add5 myInt. What does that mean? Let's look at our add5 method in line 1 that we're calling from line 6. We see a couple things in our add5 method. The first thing is in parentheses next to add5, we see it takes as an input some integer called x. We can call it whatever we want. So whenever I call the add5 method, I need to give it some integer. In our case, we're giving it myInt, or the value of 12. I also see in line 1, just like we do with formulas, we have to tell Salesforce what data type is this method going to calculate. This method is going to calculate an integer. We're starting with an integer, we're ending with an integer. We're starting with an integer x, and we're going to calculate some integer at the end. And then in line 2, we see that we're returning our final value from this method, the calculation, right? We can have a number of lines in here, but we have to end it with a return statement, returning the data type we have in our method signature, in this case, in line 1. So we have some integer x, we're going to calculate an integer, and in line 2, we see we are returning that x that we started with plus 5. So in our case, remember line 5, myInt started off as 12. So we passed 12 to our add5 method. 12 became the value of x. We added 5 to our x, added 5 to 12. And after our calculation is done, myNewInt is going to have a value of 17. So if I see this variable in myNewInt anywhere else later on in my code, I know that it's going to have the value of 17. right? We took a value we knew, we put it into a method calculation, and we output another value whose data type we specified, just like we do with formulas. All right, I'm going to walk through another example here, again, similar to one we talked about before. We took a date time, and we turned it into a text value through a series of calculations. And I'm going to do the same thing now in Apex. And again, I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm going to start with line 10. And I'm going to define a new variable of type string called myHour. And the calculation I want to make is in a method called getApplicationSubmitHour. And I'm going to pass in a value of the date time submitted from my application, which, if you recall, was April 24th, 2025, 1:15 p.m. So we pass that up here into our method, which is defined in line 1. We're passing in, as we said, a date time. And we're going to represent that date time with the variable name dt. We can call it whatever we want. I'm going to call it dt for short. We also see in line 1, just like we did in our formula, we're starting with a date time, but we have to end up with a text value, a string. So we have to turn our date time into a string somehow, just like we did in our formula above. So line 2 is just a comment, explains what we're doing a little bit. Just like we have an hour function in our code, we have an hour method in Apex. So line 3 says, I want a new variable of type integer called hour, and I want to set it equal to the value of dt.hour. Give me the hour value using this hour function, this hour method, from our date time. And if we take the hour from our date time, just like we did in our formula up above, we're going to get the number 13. So line 3, now we have an integer hour equal to the number 13. Okay, let's turn that number into text now. Just like we have the text function in a formula, we have a method called string.valueOf in Apex, which basically says, give me the string, the text interpretation of whatever this is. In our case, it's the number 13. And so line 5 is going to say, give me a new string variable called hour in text, and assign it to the value of whatever the text interpretation of my number variable was. My number was 13, so I'm going to get the text 1, 3, just like we did in our formula. Okay, now line 5, we have our string that we calculated from our date time. It's the text 1, 3. Line 7, we see we can return it back to wherever we called this method from. So we return our hour in text variable, and our string variable from line 10, my hour, is now going to be equal to the value, the text value 1, 3, because that's what we calculated, just like we did in our formula field. Okay. I'm now going to jump over to reports, right? We talked about this idea of choosing an object, choosing some fields, putting in a condition, and getting some records with all this information in it. And in Apex, we're going to do the same, but we're going to do it with what's called a SOQL query. And every SOQL query is going to look pretty similar. We're going to say, select some field names from some object where some condition is true. So just like we did in our formula, we're going to say, just like we did in our report, where we said, hey, I want to get the account name, the type, the rating fields from the account object, where the type is customer direct and customer channel. We're doing the same thing with SOQL. Give me the name, type, and rating fields from the account object, where the type is customer direct, where the type is customer channel. And if we go into any dev org and run the SOQL query, we're going to get the same records that we saw in our report, where we're doing the same thing. It's just written a little bit differently, but it's doing the same thing that we're already doing in our report. And we're going to end up with the same values as a result. Okay, we talked about this idea in flow, where when we're choosing a record triggered flow, we have to specify what object are we firing on, when is it firing, and is it going to fire before the record is saved or after the record is saved, right? We have some automation, we choose an object when it fires. And in Apex, we're doing this in our triggers. And every trigger in Apex you're going to see is going to look something like this. It's going to have the word trigger. We're going to give the trigger a name, just like we have to give our flows a name, right? I'm going to call it account trigger. I can call it whatever I want. I'm going to tell the trigger what object is it firing on. I want it to fire on account. And I specify when is it going to fire. It's going to fire when records are inserted, updated, or deleted. And it's going to fire before records are saved to the database for all these all of these instances. I can also specify I want it to fire after insert, after update, after delete, or even after undelete, right? If I brought something back from the recycle bin, for example. But it's the same concept. I choose the object that I want it to fire on, I choose when it's going to fire, and I specify is it firing before or after records are saved to the database, and that depends on what we need the trigger to do. We talked about this idea of looping through collections in a flow. We can also loop through collections in Apex. And I might have a loop that looks something like this, right? I'm going to start with another variable, a list of type opportunity, just a bunch of opportunities, in a variable that I name oplist. I can call it whatever I want. And I'm going to call some method that does a SOQL query, potentially gives me a bunch of opportunities back. So I have a list of opportunities, and I'm going to loop through them one at a time using a for loop, as we see in line 2. And I'm going to say for each opportunity in my op list, I'm going to temporarily call it O. I can call it whatever I want. For each opportunity O in my op list, set the amount on the current O to be 10,000. So if I ran this code, I would set all the amounts on all my opportunities in this list to be 10,000. In addition to updating records, we can also calculate things using loops fill, right? I might have, in line 1 of this code sample on the bottom here, a list of type integer called myIntList. And just like we did before, we're setting it to a new list of integers with the values 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'm going to calculate the sum of everything in this list. So I start with a new variable in line 2 of type integer called total, and I set it equal to a value of 0. And I say for each integer that I'm going to call I, that we cycle through in my int list, set the total equal to whatever the total was previously plus I. So we start off looping through our list one at a time. Our first integer I is going to be 1. We set the total, which was 0, equal to 0 plus 1. Okay, great. Our total is now 1. We keep going in our loop. I is now 2. Total equals 1 plus 2. Our total is now 3. Okay, our next I is 3. Total equals 3 plus 3, which is 6. Okay, we keep going. Our total is now 6 plus 4, which is 10. We keep going. Our total is now 10 plus 5, which is 15. And then the for loop says, well, I've run out of things. I'm going to exit on my own. And if I use this total variable anywhere after line 5, I know that it's going to be the value of 15 because that's what we calculated by looping through our list. All right, and lastly, we talked about manipulating S-object records in flows, right? We can create records, update records, delete records, and we can do the same thing in Apex using DML, or database manipulation language. And database manipulation language is going to look something like this, right? It's technically its own language, but I think there's like 7 words in it. And they all look something like this, that are pretty self-explanatory. I think of DML as kind of hitting a button in the Salesforce UI, right? I can make any updates to the records that I want in the UI, but until I click save, Salesforce is going to forget about it all. So example here in line 1, I have an account, a new account. It's equal to a new account where the name is Hogwarts. Salesforce doesn't care until I actually click that save button, right? Until I call my insert command in line 2, Salesforce is going to ignore it. That's my DML command. So if I go and run these first 2 lines in any dev org, I'm going to create a new account whose name is Hogwarts. Line 4 now, I'm going to run a SOQL query. I'm going to go find the amount field from some opportunity record I have where the account name is Westeros, just like I do in a report. And once I have this opportunity I've searched for called op, that's what I named it in line 4, I'm going to set the amount on this op record to $1 million. And line 7, I'm going to call my DML command. I'm going to update that op. I'm going to save it. This op now has an amount of $1 million. Okay. Let's say I wasn't supposed to do that, and actually I'm not supposed to be doing business with Westeros at all. I'm going to go ahead and run another DML command in line 9 to delete this opportunity altogether, just like hitting the delete button in the Salesforce UI, and this record is going to be deleted from Salesforce, right? Another DML command right there. Okay. Now we've talked about all the building blocks using concepts that we're already familiar with. Let's put some of these together and see what a little block of code looks like end to end. I do want to specify that when we're talking about where Apex exists, there are really 2 places it exists, right? Apex exists in triggers, which are going to fire as a result of some event, right? When accounts are inserted, when they're updated, etc. And they can also exist in classes. These are, again, just files in Salesforce. Classes do not fire on their own. They have to be called by something. They can be called by a trigger. They can be called by another class. They can be scheduled to run at a specific time. Maybe I want some code to run every night at midnight. or they can be called by my declarative tools like flows and process builder, right? Using invocable actions. And if you go into your orgs, go into setup and search for Apex, you're going to see a bunch of things. Among them, Apex triggers, where all your triggers live, and Apex classes, where all your classes live. And that's really where your Apex is going to exist. Okay, so we're going to walk through now a trigger that's going to call a class. And this trigger is going to fire on account records, and we're going to create cases for some of these accounts. And just like we would do with a very complex flow, we're going to walk through this code bit by bit, line by line, and see what it's doing, and see if we recognize any of the building blocks we just talked about. Okay, so we have a beginning of a trigger here. And hopefully we recognize some things right away, right? Line 1 we recognize is a trigger. We have the keyword trigger in purple. We also named our trigger, account trigger, and we're firing this trigger on the account object. And we want this trigger to run after accounts are inserted to the database or after accounts are updated in the database, right? So anytime accounts are inserted or updated, after they're saved, this trigger is going to fire. Okay. Line 3, we see we're creating a new list of accounts, a new variable called new accounts, and we're setting it equal to the value of trigger.new. Apex triggers have a few special variables that let you work with the records that fired them. For example, all of the records that cause this trigger to fire are going to be stored in the value trigger.new, the new values of all these records. You can also imagine the old values of all these records are going to be in trigger.old. And so a very common use case in triggers to compare the values in trigger.old with trigger.new and see if anything changed. For now, we're just going to work with trigger.new though. So let's say I use data loader, I uploaded 100 accounts to the system. Those 100 accounts are going to cause this trigger to fire. All of those accounts are going to be in trigger.new. To make it a little bit easier to follow though, we're going to take those trigger.new accounts and we're going to put them in a list variable called new accounts. But those are all the new accounts that cause the trigger to fire. Line 4, we see another variable, which is of type list of cases, called cases to insert. So again, giving it a helpful name that tells us what we're going to be doing. We're capturing cases, we're going to be inserting them, right? So these are going to be our cases to insert. And for now, it's just a new list of cases that has nothing in it. So we're going to have to populate this later. Okay, so we have these two variables in our trigger. Let's keep going. Now we have a for loop. We're going to take all these accounts and new accounts. We're going to loop through them one at a time. And just like we were before setting the priority based on the amount, we're going to be setting the rating on these accounts based on the annual revenue. So line 6 says, okay, I have a for loop for each account called ACCT in my new accounts variable I defined in line 3. Let's loop through them one at a time. Line 7, we see our first conditional statement. We're going to check the annual revenue on the current ACCT we're looking at. And we're going to say, hey, if the annual revenue on this account is greater than 500,000, set the rating on that same account to high. Line 9, we have our else if, right? Check the next condition. If the annual revenue, maybe not greater than 500,000, but still greater than 100,000, great, let's set the rating to warm. If the annual revenue is less than 100,000, let's set the rating to cold. On this account, maybe it's not as popular an account. Okay, so good so far. We're looping through our accounts one at a time, and we're setting the rating based on the annual revenue. Let's keep going. In addition to setting the rating on these cold accounts, we might want to take some additional action though. And in our case, as part of this else block, we're going to be creating a new case for all of these low revenue accounts. So I see in line 14, I have a new case variable called new case. I'm going to set it equal to some calculation we're going to do somewhere else. And then line 15, we're going to take that new case we calculated and add it to our cases to insert variable we defined on line 4, right? We started off with an empty cases to insert variable. Every time we see we have a cold account, we're going to create a new case for it, add to this cases to insert variable. Let's take a second, though, and take a look at what's actually happening in this black box, right? We said we're creating a case. Let's go see where the magic's happening. What we're doing here is we're calling a method called createCase in a class called accountTriggerHandler. A very common pattern, right? We generally don't want to put logic in our triggers. We usually put them in classes that we call. So I have a class I named accountTriggerHandler to handle accounts in our trigger. We know we have a method called createCase, and we know we're passing an account to it, right? We're giving it the input that we know, ACCT, and we're expecting to output or return a case at the end. So let's go take a look at that method. And it looks something like this. Line 1, we see we have a new class called account trigger handler. Line 2, we see we have a new create case method. We took in an account called ACCT, which we already knew, and we are returning a case, as we see in line 2, in this box, which again, we already knew. Okay, so we're starting with an account, we need to get a case. How are we doing that? Well, we start off in our method, line 3. Again, we're creating a new case variable called new case. This is the new case we're working with, and we're assigning it to an empty case record for now. And then we're going to populate some fields on this case, right? So we took an account, we're returning a case, and we're going to use this account to populate the fields on our case. Line 4, we're going to set the subject on our case to be low revenue account plus the name of our account. We're then specifying, okay, our account ID should be the ID on the account that caused this to fire. Again, because we are firing this in an after insert context or an after update context, all of our accounts will have their IDs saved to the database already, so we can easily assign our cases to the accounts. We'll set a description on the case, a status on the case, and then we'll assign the owner of the case to the same owner that was on our account. We have all that information already. And now in line 11, we can go ahead and return our new case back to the trigger that called it. Okay, so we started with an account, we created a case, returning that case to our trigger, we add it to our cases to insert list, and then again, we need to make sure we're hitting our save button. We have our DML in line 18 to insert these new cases into the database for all of our cold accounts. Okay, I know that was kind of a lot to get through. How do we kind of build and take it from here? I want to summarize some of what we talked about already, right? At the end of the day, code is ones and zeros. And while declarative tools make it easy to write code, sometimes some things can get lost in translation, and that's where code can come in very handy. The declarative tools you already know how to use are based on various concepts, and Apex is based on these same concepts that you already know how to do, right? We can combine all these Apex building blocks and concepts into triggers and classes. And if you can begin the process of understanding code, do a Google search, use some AI tools to help you, you can begin the process of writing code, right? But even understanding how all of the declarative tools work and learning a little bit of the coding syntax can begin the process of understanding code. And if you still don't feel like a developer yet, I promise that you're almost there. So your next steps, when you go back to work later today, later this week, when you have some time, take a look at some code in your org, right? We went through the code that we walked through line by line, piece by piece, just like with a complex flow. So go back to your orgs, go into setup, look at your Apex triggers, look at your Apex classes. Identify the blocks of code you already know how to use, right? See if you can find the if statements, the variables, the for loops, the SOQL queries, the DML statements, the methods and the method calls, and the return statements in those methods. And try to follow a path of your code end to end. What happens when accounts are inserted? What triggers, or hopefully individual trigger, is it firing? What classes is it calling? And the next time you have an issue with people inserting accounts, you can maybe start through walking through it yourself and figuring out what's actually happening in these triggers and in these classes when accounts are inserted. Building on this, wanting to learn more though, the first place I always recommend dipping your toe in the water is Trailhead. It's great for learning terminology, getting a little bit of practice, but there are also a lot of resources for learning more. One of the places that helped me out, one of my coworkers, David Liu, has this website, sfdc99.com, some intro to Apex code examples on there. One of the founders of Rad Women, also now a Google colleague of mine, Kieran Jameson, womencodeheroes.com, highly recommend some Apex examples there. Again, I have some courses on Pluralsight. Feel free to send me a message afterward. Happy to send you a code if you're studying for PD1. Those are good through the end of June. AI tools, AI can do a lot of things. One of the things is helping you with code. I would suggest being careful with putting in your company's code into AI tools or using verbatim what AI tools spit out. But it potentially can get you a starting point, or even using Agentforce for developers potentially in your org to start saying, hey, give me some code that does this, or hey, I have a block of code that does that. Can you explain what it's doing? Agentforce for developers, I know, has some commands to actually explain what code is doing as well, so I highly recommend looking into that too. And I have a QR code and a bit.ly link with some additional resources, some Apex practice sites, and some additional courses and things like that from other people to help you out as well. All right. With that, happy to also take some Q&A. Happy to answer any questions offline today or after as well, though.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. That was fantastic. If you have questions, folks, please queue them up. But let me just start with that. Start with a question. Adam, when you look at somebody's use case or user story they share with you, they say, okay, I want to do this. Whichever tool is the best tool, it doesn't matter. I just want to accomplish this in a Salesforce org, automate something, right? What are the typical use cases where you look at it and say, like, you don't really want to do that in Flow. This should be code if you know how to code. Typical examples.
Sure. I think the answer, and I know it's not going to be exactly what you're looking for, but it's always it depends, right? And I think it depends on a lot of different factors. One of them is what do you already have already in your org? If I have a flow doing everything on accounts and I need to do something else, it doesn't necessarily make sense to put that in a trigger. Conversely, if I'm in an existing org and I already have all my logic for accounts in triggers, does it make sense to add a small little flow to do one thing? Maybe not. I think the mantra clicks before code always holds true. I would say if there are things you can do with declarative tools like flows that you don't need Apex for, and I feel like with each release, there's more and more you can do with flows that you don't need Apex for. That's great. Flows, I think, are easier to maintain. But there's not necessarily a clear cut answer. So I'd say take a look at what is existing, what's already happening uh, in the context of what you're trying to do. But also it makes more sense looking at the team you have. If I have a team of 5 admins and no developers, yeah, I definitely want to look at flows first. My team, for example, is probably the other way. Most of us are developer first, and so our first instinct is to jump into code. And so we have to take a step back and say, maybe kind of flow solve this. And I think our team is getting a little bit better at putting things in flows when we can, especially with screen flows. But it definitely does depend. I think both tools are great. They're definitely getting up to parity. I think there are still some things that are easier to do or more straightforward to do in a trigger. I'm probably more comfortable with writing code than I am with building flows personally, just from experience. But a lot of different factors, I'd say, go into that. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful, at least.
Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful. One more question. I actually um, tried on the code builder, tried to use Apex Grew. I don't know why it didn't work, but it didn't work for me. I couldn't activate it. My question was because I haven't tried it yet. When getting help on your Apex code, which tool do you find most useful or most capable? Is it Apex Grew, Gemini, ChatGPT, or Claude? What is it?
So I haven't used any of them too much for Apex just yet. I have used it for other languages that I don't necessarily know very well. As an example, one of the things I have in my, I'm going to do a shameless plug for my Pluralsight courses, but I have some instructions on here for things to do, code to run via a Mac to install some records, do a replacement in your code, and things like that. And I know how to do it on a Mac. I do not know. I found out later that this command does not work on Windows because Windows are built differently than Mac, and I have no idea how to write whatever the language is that works with Windows. I think it's PowerShell. So I had to use ChatGPT to say, "Hey, this is what I'm trying to do on Mac. Can you give me the same output for Windows?" And I eventually figured I had to do it in 2 commands, and eventually figured out how to do it in PowerShell. So again, I think it's a great starting point. It's not perfect. I definitely recommend testing it. Using existing code that you have, I think, is great for building on. I steal things from my coworkers all the time. Oh, you already figured out this problem. Let me take that and fix it myself. But I think that also goes back to where I talk about how understanding code is very helpful. Because if you can understand code and you know what a code block is doing, you can potentially tweak it to write working code yourself. So a lot of these tools aren't perfect, but they will get you started. I think Agentforce for developers is helpful, specifically for Salesforce, because it will tell you, it can comment your code for you. It can explain what a code block is doing. It can get you started. But again, I would say none of these tools are a perfect, drag and drop. You do need to make sure it's working. you do need to understand what it's trying to do. And hopefully by breaking it down into some of these building blocks, you can understand what a larger code block is doing.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have two questions here in chat. Let's try to go through them. We have only a few minutes. Steve says,
Sure.
for someone pretty proficient in flows, how much time and effort would it be to get to PD1 cert? And the best method to learn with support? Can't get into rad women code, of course, says Steve.
Sure.
Yeah. We have
Yeah.
another one
So
from Dana, but I'll hold off on that.
yeah. So I would say, these are good starting points for learning code in general. Right. SFDC 99 has a bunch of, is this what I wanted or I want the other one? Yeah, beginner tutorials on Apex. So talks about, Apex basics and stuff like that. Some YouTube videos there. I also have presented a few times at Apex Hours. I don't know how many hours they have there, but many hours worth, 23 videos, many hours of training, and I think they have a bunch of kind of things you can go through on there. So a lot of resources on this link that I shared. I can put it in the chat also if that's a little bit easier. Um, so that's a good place to get started. I would say keep up the practice with it though. One thing, I think the next a person mentioned as well. I'm just going to put in my.
Yeah, Dana wanted to know, what does Pluralsight cover exactly?
Yeah, so let me pull this up here. The profile. Okay. Yeah, so I have. If you look at the where is it? Credentials, certifications, and pull up Platform Developer One. You'll see they break it down into a couple different categories. And if I go to developer and Trailhead wants to cooperate, Salesforce developer, okay. And I go look at, where is platform developer on here? Platform developer one. And I go look at, which one do I want? This one maybe? One of these has a study guide where it breaks down into, okay, so we have fundamentals, we have automation and logic, we have user interface, and we have testing, debugging, and deployment. And so I have courses on fundamentals, data modeling, user interface, process automation, testing, debugging, and deployment. So basically each course is focused on a specific category from the study guide. So that's one option for PD1 specifically. So it is focused, built off directly off of the study guide with some examples. Again, I have some some instructions for downloading the code in there. You'll get all the code yourself, so you can see what it's doing, walk through it as I'm building it in the code, play around with it yourself. But also on top of that, there are other courses from David also, where he has some intro to code or intro to Apex courses on Pluralsight. Another Salesforce developer, Dan Appleman, has some courses. So a bunch of Salesforce developers have courses on there. There's also another academy that I think Warren Walters, the Salesforce MVP, put together, Cloud Code Academy, where you can meet with other people and go through an academy that he has set up. Sally Al Ghul, also some YouTube videos where she does some live coding. You have the opportunity to ask her questions. And so definitely a lot of resources out there that I would say, both for learning the code and targeted at PD1 specifically. I think depending, the question was how much time and effort would it be? It kind of depends on how much time and effort you have. I would say what I like to do generally when I'm scheduling a certification, I schedule it 6 months in advance just to give me a deadline to kind of force myself to study a little bit day by day. So depending on how much you've worked with, how much you're starting from, even 5 minutes a day, looking at stuff, writing a little bit of code. There's another website on here that'll give you some practice problems. And you can, it'll give you practice problems and you can have a check if the code is right or not, similar to what Trailhead does. So I'd recommend going through some of those, studying a little bit day by day, putting it on the calendar. If there are specific topics you're struggling through, go through the trail mix prep, go through the trail mix thing they have here. Use some of these resources, try to practice on your own, and feel free to reach out if you have additional questions or you're struggling on any category in particular. Hopefully
Well,
those
thank
helped
you.
answer those two questions.
Thank you very much, Adam. And I want to add also from my experience, because I've done this a couple of years back, I think the hands-on practice is key here. And what I would try and do is try and put together like a small group of motivated people, kind of do your own boot camp so that you can touch code, trying to achieve things. And then if you get stuck, ask each other. You can always come to the Flownatic Slack workspace, and then we can open a channel for you for the Apex learners as well. So try and facilitate that a little bit. But if you're gonna stay active, I think 6 months is a realistic expectation from my experience as well. Thank you very much, everybody. One last question. What was that sandbox practice site? What does that mean, Barbara?
I think that's
You
linked
understand?
in this resource doc as well. I had it's apexsandbox.io, but it's linked in
Okay.
here as well.
Apexsandbox.io, Barbara.
Yeah.
That's that one. All right. Well, have a great day, everybody. Thank you very much, Adam, for this. And I'll get this one edited and published soon in Safe Travels to Work.